Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I'm also the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race, and Rights. You can follow me on social media at Sahar Aziz Law and learn more about my work at saharazizlaw.com. The Center for Security, Race, and Rights, also known as CSRR, engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit csrr.rutgers.edu and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and at RUCSRR. If you find this podcast informative, please consider making a tax-deductible donation by going to csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. Today's episode is entitled European Islamophobia, featuring Farid Hafez, Assistant Professor of International Relations at William & Mary University. Professor Hafez examines the troubling surge of anti-Muslim sentiment sweeping across Europe, where millions of Muslims call home. Against a backdrop of rising white nationalist movements, heated immigration debates, and increasing religious tensions, Professor Hafez offers a nuanced analysis that goes beyond headlines to examine the historical roots, institutional mechanisms, and social dynamics fueling Islamophobia. He explains how European Muslims respond to increased marginalization and what solutions might bridge growing divides in European society. Professor Hafez's insights reveal how this prejudice shapes everything from policy decisions and media narratives to daily interactions in diverse communities. Let's hear what our guest has to say about a topic that threatens political liberalism in contemporary Europe.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Sahar, Aziz. Thank you for having me here and giving me this virtual floor. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be part of such a series dedicated to discussing critical issues of our times in a historical and also from a post-imperial and post-colonial perspective. Now, I would like to start my talk with a short quote that was given by a very recognized politician of the mainstream, who is actually the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. Himself a member of the Social Democratic Party, so we're speaking about a centrist left person, right? And not long ago, a month and a half, he gave a talk. And during this talk, one of the things that he said was, quote unquote, Europe is a garden. Most of the rest of the world is a jungle. The jungle could invade the garden. The gardeners should take care of it. The jungle has a strong growth capacity. The wall will never be high enough in order to protect the garden. The gardeners have to go into the jungle. Europeans have to be engaged much more with the world. End quote. Now, the reason I'm bringing this quote and starting my talk with that is because very often when we think about Islamophobia, especially in the case of Europe, we think about the rise of right-wing populism. We think about underground neo-Nazi movements and organizations who kill people, and so on and so forth. But I think one of the real problems that we are facing when we're talking about Islamophobia in Europe is really how much mainstream politicians are reproducing a structural inequality between what is perceived as the Muslim other, or not the rest of the society, but the white dominant culture that we see. Now, obviously, I mean, if I would give this quote that I just gave and say somebody in the late 19th century who was a colonial governor somewhere in an African country would have said that, I think nobody would be astonished. But how comes that somebody in the year 2022 representing the European Union, which it conceives of itself as being a project of freedom, a project that is informed by Enlightenment thought, and that stands for pluralism and human rights. How can it happen that somebody like that speaks the way he does, right? Speaking of Europe as a garden, the rest of the world as a jungle, speaking also of and explicitly mentioning that this jungle has to be protected by walls. And everything that comes to your mind that is implicated by that is that there are thousands of people coming to Europe every year as immigrants from Middle East and Northern Africa, but also from Asian countries, Iraq and Syria first and foremost, but also Afghanistan. In fact, most of these people who are the immigrants are also at the very same time not only people of color, but they are also people who belong to the Muslim religion. So there is this idea that is implicated, I think, very much in this quote that tells us that there is a barrier and a self-conception of Europe as the enlightened, civilized place that has basically to civilize the other. Something which is very reminiscent of the colonial discourse in the late 19th century, when Europeans went out to the world to civilize the colonized subject. Now, therefore, I think one of the problems that we are facing when we talk about Islamophobia is, in fact, what some historians have called the colonial amnesia of Europe, right? And a lot of historians, when they talk about that, what they mean is that there is a perception of Europe that it is untouched by its own colonial history. To give you one example, like when we speak, for instance, about Germany and the history of National Socialism, the idea very often in the German public, for instance, in regards to National Socialism, is that it was an interruption of the history. It was something that is not really conceived of as being related to a larger history of colonial expansion, nor to a larger history of race, of a global racial hierarchy that sees the white as the superior in that hierarchy or the empire. And along with that goes also the perception that today's Europe is untouched by race matters. So we have very much in continental Europe, and I would say in all over Europe, except of the Anglophone world, which is the UK, this idea that after 1945, after the end of the Second World War, after the end of the Nazi regime, and after the end of the Holocaust, race does not matter anymore. And we are a colorblind continent. So this imagination, self-perception of Europe as this colorblind continent, where basically there is no difference in terms of along the lines of nationality and ethnicity, that also implies that the post-colonial subjects are actually positioned outside of European history. So in a way, as some scholars like Fatima El-Taib, for instance, have argued, what we see here is the exclusion of colonialism from the presence of Europe. And that leads to this externalization of the post-colonial subjects and populations. And colonialism basically is not conceived as any kind of key event that has shaped contemporary Europe. Now, the reason I'm talking about like this, all of this history is because it complicates and makes it so difficult to speak about Islamophobia. Why? Because very similar to anti-Semitism, more than 100 years ago, the general public in Europe would speak, and I can just remind you of Karl Marx and many other authors who have spoken about that this way. They related to the question of Jews in Europe as the so-called Jewish question. Now, looking at it in retrospective, we can say, well, that was about anti-Semitism, right? It was not about a real Jewish question there, or as some critical Jewish scholars called it, the real question was actually never the Jewish question, it was the German question. As much as there was never in the United States the N question, the question about Black people, but rather there was a white question. And whites had to ask themselves, why do they need this imagination about the Black person? Similar to that in Europe, people related to the so-called Jewish question as a real question. So now when we speak about Islamophobia today, you will see that a lot of people are actually denying that there is something that we call Islamophobia. And that is still very widespread in European policy circles. So to an extent that even if they accept there is a problem called Islamophobia, they would argue that, well, but there is also Islamic terrorism. So, there is a reason for why we have these prejudices. Those stereotypes, they have a grounding in the reality. And that makes it very complicated to really have an honest conversation about Islamophobia in Europe itself. Now, again, that does not mean that there are no people speaking about Islamophobia in Europe, obviously. And I think there was a key moment with the terrorist attack of Anders Behring Breivik in 2011. For those of you who do not remember, Anders Behring Breivik was a white supremacist killing 77 people in Oslo and Utøya in Norway, allegedly defending the white Christian Europe against an Islamization or an Islamic invasion, an invasion by Muslims that would be enhanced by social democratic and other liberal forces within Europe that are open to immigration. So therefore, he went basically to a camp of socialist youth, or the socialist youth chapter of the Social Democratic Party, and killed a bunch of young people there. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because Anders Behring Breivik could not be denied anymore. And it could not be denied that this was very much related to a very explicit Islamophobic ideology. He basically killed people because he believed the continent would be swamped over by Muslim populations, immigrants. And that changed something. If you look into the media coverage, 2011 was the moment when Islamophobia as a terminology even emerged in the public square much more than ever before. Now, at the very same time, looking back at what happened the last 11 years, in this year, in March, the United Nations unanimously accepted a resolution on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to declare the 15th of March, which marked the anniversary of the New Zealand attack again that killed 51 Muslim people in 2 mosques. It accepted a resolution that called the 15th of March the International Day to Combat Islamophobia in commemoration of this Christchurch attack in New Zealand. Now, it is interesting that this resolution was accepted unanimously, but at the very same time, what we see is the European reaction was quite interesting to observe. So there were actually 3 voices that challenged the resolution. One was India. And again, I think in terms of Islamophobia, we should not be astonished at all. There is an awful dimension of killing, destruction, and exclusion going on in India in these days. But it was also 2 other, besides India, 2 other voices. On the one hand, the representative of France, and on the other hand, the representative of the European Union, who is only there as a delegate with no voting rights, but still, those were the 3 voices that contested the resolution. And the critique they expressed during the deliberations was that, according to them, basically they do not want really to tackle Islamophobia, I would argue, especially in terms of France, because what is going on and what we are witnessing during these days in countries like France is very much that the state itself becomes the primary actor of Islamophobia. And what we are witnessing is a state Islamophobia of cracking down against a lot of Muslim civil societies. So they were talking about a resolution against Islamophobia could silence any kind of critique vis-a-vis Islam. So we should discuss this. But at the end of the day, again, they very much accepted it. Now, why has the delegate of the European Union expressed critique? Now, there is an interesting institutional aspect to that in regards to the European Union, because in December 2015, a position was created that was called the Coordinator on Anti-Muslim Hatred. Now, this position's mandate was to address anti-Muslim hate speech and hate crimes and discrimination. It was not tackling racism as an institutional problem that would in itself question a lot of the institutional aspects of the European Union itself. And there have been a lot of concerns also in terms of the mandate that this position had. But what is interesting is that this position has been void since the end of July 2021, more than a year now. So we can see the reluctance of a lot of European institutions in itself in tackling Islamophobia. To give you also put this in a bit of a comparative perspective, there is a resolution by the European Parliament against anti-Semitism. There is a resolution that exists against anti-Gypsyism, but there is no resolution against Islamophobia, right? And that, again, tells you something about the willingness or the silence that exists on behalf of large parts of the European Parliament that are directly elected by nation populations, in terms of how willing or unwilling they are in regard to even creating a consciousness and doing something against Islamophobia. Now, I could speak about a lot of institutional problems, talk about several cases, but I really want to focus on two major issues here. Also in terms of maybe having a US audience in this virtual room to speak a little bit about the differences that we see in contrast to the United States. Now, I think one of the most important aspects in what shapes European nation states' policies vis-a-vis its Muslim populations is a very different understanding of what secularism means. Although not every European nation state, single nation state, has the very same pattern in terms of how it governs its the state authorities' relationships to churches and other denominations, what we find in most, although not every European nation state, is that there is an understanding of, to some sort, a privileging of the dominant Christian churches. Although that is, again, there is no uniform way of how to do that, there still is this conception of a lot of European nation states conceiving of themselves as being not representing a specific Christian church, although we do also have that, for instance, in the UK and some Scandinavian countries. There is this idea that there is a cooperative relationship between state authorities and churches, especially in countries like Germany, for instance, or Austria, where I originally come from. What is most important here is that, especially in the mid-2000 years, around 2005, 6, 7, there was an emerging idea on behalf of the ministries of the interior that they are actually in charge of the Muslim communities. While other churches and denominations, as political institutions, were always related to by the state authorities that were in charge of cultural or educational affairs. So you can already see, in terms of the institutional approach, that European nation states primarily perceived their Muslim citizens or their Muslim populations as a security threat. And that's why the Ministry of Interior had to deal with it. Now, several European countries like Germany and France and Austria and the Netherlands and even England, to an extent, have implemented a lot of policies based on the idea of countering violent extremism, similar to the stories that you know from the US. And as you know, that has been, in fact, a global phenomenon. We had the UN resolutions that were basically advising its member states to introduce CVE projects in order to counter radicalization. And we have seen throughout the last 10, 15 years that this has very much disproportionately affected the Muslim communities. And even the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union has previously published a report where it warned that this is very much endangering basic rights of especially the Muslim community. Nevertheless, what we can see, especially within the last 3 to 4 years, and I would say it is very much also related to the Arab Spring, is that a number of countries have started becoming like the main drivers of a form of Islamophobic politics that is implemented by the government itself. I have mentioned France, and I think France, alongside Austria, together has become the major driving force in implementing a sort of state Islamophobia that is, in fact, in a way, criminalizing the Muslim community. So in the name not of, and you know, the way they have done so was not by co-opting in a pure way the very racist far-right policies that have been claimed for in the last couple of years. But what they did is they basically reframed the problem as being a political problem, not a problem of religion. In a way, by arguing that we want to defend the rights of the vast majority of Muslims, and we even want to support the vast majority of Muslims who are peaceful people. That was kind of the discourse, to protect them from what they now framed as being, in France, Islamist separatism, or in Austria, political Islam, or in Germany, legalistic Islamism. So the idea that they introduced was basically to defend the vast majority of Muslims against what they saw as a form of political manipulation of Islam. Now, the problem with that is that these governments, what they meant when they talked about Islamist separatism or political Islam, was not so much a form of a political degenerated version of Islam, but rather it was Islam itself. To give you a few examples, when, for instance, the hijab ban was introduced in Austria, the argument was that the headscarf was a symbol of political Islam. When mosques were closed, again, the argument was we are cracking down on political Islam, not on Muslim civil society. So in a way, what that helped to do is positioning the Islamophobic and framing the Islamophobic discriminatory policies as not in contradiction to human rights and religious freedom, but rather as a legitimate way to secure the rights of the vast majority of Muslims, protect them against the evil of political Islam, and also frame this as a security measure. And in that way, a lot of these policies could also go unnoticed because there was no huge outcry, because the way it was framed was very much in this liberal kind of discourse of being aligned to human rights and religious freedom. And the way how I see these policies evolving over time is very much similar to what I see as this general political demonization that we had, for instance, in the United States when Senator Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s started this kind of witch hunt against black and left-wing groups under the banner of basically fighting communism. So the way how in the age of the Cold War era, these anti-communist policies were legitimized against any kind of political opposition on a domestic level, similar to that we can see today how political Islam is being portrayed as this great danger that is basically a threat to the domestic security of those European nation states. But in both cases, like fundamental rights such as freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of religion are very much at risk. And we could see that with a lot of Muslim associations that have been closed down in France in the name of fighting Islamist separatism. Even anti-racist watchdogs, like most prominently Collective Against Islamophobia in France, that was closed again with the argument that accusing the French state of state Islamophobia is dividing the French society and is in a way also posing a security threat because it is radicalizing the future generation, and therefore based on anti-terrorism legislation, that watchdog was closed down. So these are just like a few examples of where I see a very dangerous development currently in some of the European nation states that are endangering their own Muslim communities in the name of anti-terrorism legislation, in the name of social cohesion, that is also in many ways also very troubling in terms of the potential critique that could emerge coming from critical NGOs, but also critical scholars working on these issues. When a couple of years ago in 2020, when the French government was basically accusing critical scholars of importing gender studies, post-colonial studies, and critical race theory from the US to divide the French society, or the Danish case where we had a parliament resolution that was asking scholars not to be involved in politics, or even in cases where we see that Islamophobia studies is being reframed as an attempt to create a worldwide caliphate. All of these examples are examples where we see that all kind of pushback coming from critical scholarship is in itself being reframed as a form of terrorism that has to be stopped in order to save the cohesion of national body.
So as somebody who
researches anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia in the U.S., I can't help but see many of the parallels. And I'm hoping that today we can unpack and show the differences and the similarities, since we do have a large American audience. So the first issue or theme that comes to mind is this misnomer, right, or this connection between Islamic terrorism and Islam, the religion. And therefore, when states or actors are engaging in what we would consider Islamophobia, they argue, no, we're just engaging in rational, smart, patriotic national security practices and policies. And so that is certainly a large theme, or an underpinning theme here in the U.S. And yet, and this is a question that I want to ask you specifically about Europe, and yet we have this rise of white right-wing extremism and political violence. I wouldn't even call it extremism, because that could be simply having extreme political beliefs, which in the U.S. context is completely legal and some would argue very American. But once you start acting on those beliefs through violence or violating the law, then you are no longer in the safe zone of protection, at least legal protection, and even social acceptance. And yet we're not seeing churches being subjected to countering violent extremism programs. We're not seeing white men, who often tend to be the most common demographic of mass shootings, or especially when it's in the form of racial violence. We're not seeing white conservatives, Christians, who believe that the state should prohibit abortion on their religious beliefs grounds, or believe that church religion should be taught in schools, or believe that state funds should go towards paying private religious schools' expenses. So there are many people that are what I call the Christian Brotherhood, right, in the U.S., and yet they are not subjected to nearly, if any, state persecution or state attack and social stigma that those who were pejoratively termed political Islamists, or as you said, political Islamists, legalistic Islamism, and Islamist separatism. That's interesting that there are these different terms. I think here everybody just gets congealed into one. And so the question is really, how is Europe dealing with this rise of the far right, which I think is even much more on display in Europe, because they're winning in elections and they are organized political parties, as opposed to, yes, we had that as the base of our president, Donald Trump, or former president, and we certainly they were the driving force for the attempted insurrection. But the Republican Party, at least, does not as openly claim that it is as far right as some of the European parties. The question, again, is how is Europe, and I know there are so many different countries, so I don't want you to generalize the entire continent, but if you want to use some case studies, but how are they dealing with this problem?
All right. Now, I think that's an interesting question, and let me give a historical lens as well as a more contemporary problematization. Now, on the one hand, let me speak about Germany. Okay, Germany, why? Because it's an important country. It's one of the two leading countries in the European Union. Nothing goes without Germany or France. In Germany, after the end of the Nazi regime, the Ministry of Interior and a lot of the intelligence service people, there was some sort of continuity between the political order before the Nazi regime and the post-war German political order. Even in a country like where I come from, Austria, the Ministry of Interior, when you see elections for the unions, it is the strongest ministry with the highest percentage of far-right support, a third at least. All right. So there is, historically speaking, I think what we have to recognize, a linkage between the fascist era and what we see today in Europe. And we should not underestimate that. Even one like the former head of the German Secret Service, Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz in Germany, after he retired from his position, he was very openly embracing the far-right alternative for Germany, right? A lot of their policy claims. So he was always very silent during his tenure. But what does, again, that tell us about the ideology that is prevalent in many of those institutions? Now, that is a problem. Why? Because looking back for the German case, and there was one very prominent case, the so-called NSU case, National Socialist Underground. Within 10 to 15 years, there were several killings of people of color, people who were owning kebab stores, like serving traditional Turkish food. And the media coverage throughout those 10, 15 years was there is an inner ethnic conflict amongst immigrants, amongst people of color. Now, many, many years after that, it became more public that actually the ones who killed those people, all of those people, were part and parcel of an underground right-wing movement, and the Secret Service was aware of it, but he would not speak out. Now, if we assume that the far-right underground is a problem for these European nation states, and it is to some extent. Actually, just today in the morning, there was a huge raid in Germany and also in some other countries for people who wanted basically to create a new political order, the so-called Reichsbürger, which is also in a way a very far-right conspiratory group. Even if we assume that some of those, that there are links between the nationalist underground and some parts of the administration, especially in the departments of defense and departments of interior affairs, the problem has grown. And I'll just give you one example. In 2019, there was a mainstream German politician from the Christian Democratic Union, Walter Lübcke, who was killed on his private balcony by a sniper who has been part of a far-right underground movement. And one of the things that they found during one of the raids was a list with 20,000 names of people who were pro-immigration. Now, it was never disclosed, so we don't know, were those people including also like people of color who were leading civil society organizations? Was it just like including mainstream politicians who were pro-multiculturalism, pro-immigration? But it definitely showed like the extent of the problem that is existing. Still, we would see that the overall public discourse has not shifted to, well, we see homegrown kind of white supremacism as a problem, but still the main discourse continues to be around the Muslim problem. So I doubt that it will profoundly change something unless there is a major event that happens that would wake up larger parts of the public. Thank you, first of all, for having me. It was a great opportunity to discuss a couple of interesting points and aspects to this discussion. You know, being somebody who left Europe also because of Islamophobia to a large extent, and now being a resident of the United States, and to an extent also having in mind that there are a lot of similar people like me who are leaving Europe because they see that there is a growing danger of simply living as a common person and continuing one's life that is threatened by a lot of this violence that we see, not violence in the sense of the radical right only, but structural violence that just does not allow for Muslim people to live a normal life. I really would more as a policy recommendation say, keep your eyes on countries like Denmark, like France, like Austria, at the forefront of problematizing Muslims in a very institutionalized and very often not visible way, but that really harms Muslim life, while at the very same time trying to position themselves as defenders against anti-Semitism and the Jewish life, but at the very same time basically taking no lesson of whatsoever happened with anti-Semitism in Europe. So therefore, I think, this is just like a personal wish note at this point to say, keep your eyes open and try to keep up the conversation, create a consciousness that there is really a problem that is going on. And I think even, the U.S. State Department's last year's reports on international religious freedom by the Office of International Religious Freedom could be read even as, to some extent, an Islamophobia report. So it really shows us that this is a problem also state institutions see that is of growing concern to a lot of people in Europe and the world.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School. also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race, and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.